The whole ballroom seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The Brighton Hills Centennial wasn't just a party. It was the biggest event in the city's history. The moment when all eyes in the country were on that small haven of immaculate streets and luxurious mansions. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden sparkles over champagne flutes, while politicians, entrepreneurs, and representatives of the elite mingled in conversations that revolved around status and power. On stage, a red curtain covered the plaque that would reveal the name of the person to be honored for keeping the city as the most prosperous, safe, and exemplary in the nation. President Williams was already present, accompanied by ministers and television cameras. The air seemed charged, as if something grandiose was about to happen, but no one could imagine the shock that was coming. It was into this environment that Ayla walked. Her kinky, coily hair was loose, forming a crown that she wore with pride, but which for many there was a reason for disdain. The dress she had chosen was simple, elegant, but without ostentation, standing out from the luxurious excess of the women who displayed diamonds around their necks and dresses that cost fortunes. A few seconds were enough for the gazes to cross the room and fall on her, first curiosity, then discomfort, and then contempt. "Who let her in here?" whispered a superior-looking lady. "She must be part of the staff. She doesn't belong in this section," replied another, drawing muffled laughter. Ayla felt the weight of those words but kept her head high. She knew her place was there, even if no one knew it yet. The whispers intensified as she approached the front rows where only the most influential names were seated. A man in an expensive suit stood up and blocked her passage, smiling sarcastically. "Miss, this area is reserved. Please, step back where you belong." The paternalistic tone concealed a familiar venom, the racism that disguised humiliation as politeness. Ayla tried to explain that she had the right to be there, but didn't have time to finish the sentence. Another woman holding a glass commented loudly enough for everyone to hear, "It's unbelievable how some people don't know their place." Laughter echoed, cutting Ayla's heart like invisible knives. The room, previously filled with festive expectation, now vibrated with collective hostility against a single presence. Even under pressure, Ayla did not back down. Her breathing was heavy, but her steady eyes revealed an inner strength no one could imagine. She remembered the words of Edward, the old mailman who had been her father and mentor. "One day they will all bow before you." This phrase echoed like an invisible shield. But at that moment it seemed impossible to believe, because every step she took was accompanied by cruel comments about her skin, about her hair, about her presence. It was as if the whole room was conspiring to expel her, as if her existence in that space was a crime. Until someone, impatient, grabbed her arm and lightly pushed her back, as one would dismiss an annoyance. Ayla almost fell but regained her composure, holding firm to the pride she had left. The silence that followed was so intense that even the glasses stopped clinking. And it was in this silence that the master of ceremonies climbed onto the stage. With a solemn voice, he announced that the most anticipated moment had arrived. President Williams walked to the center, accompanied by camera flashes and deafening applause. The red curtain was pulled, revealing the name of the honoree. For a second, everyone held their breath. What appeared engraved in golden letters made the entire room turn into a sea of astonishment. Ayla. The four letters resonated like thunder in every prejudiced mind that had humiliated her minutes before. The expressions of laughter froze into masks of disbelief. Nervous murmurs spread, followed by exclamations of shock. "This must be a mistake. She has nothing to do with this city. So who dared to write that name?" The shock spread through the room like fire on dry straw. No one believed what they saw, and glances crossed in search of an explanation. Some still tried to laugh as if it were just a malicious joke of destiny, but the weight of President Williams' presence made it clear that there was no mistake. He raised his hand, asking for silence, and the room, which seconds before had been taken by chaos, fell into a suffocating quietness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his firm, grave voice echoing through the microphone. "Tonight we honor not only the city of Brighton Hills, but also the soul behind its greatness." The president paused, letting the words infiltrate everyone's minds. The prejudiced elite were already sweating, restless, exchanging nervous glances. For decades, you believed this city belonged to the wealthy men and women sitting in these very chairs. You believed prosperity was the work of your so-called effort, But the truth is far from that. The broadcaster's camera slowly turned, capturing every expression of shame and disbelief. Ayla, still standing among the crowd, felt her heart race. She knew that this was the moment when her life would change forever. But she didn't imagine it would be in such a grand way. Brighton Hills, continued President Williams, was built and sustained by a man you all overlooked. A man who lived humbly, delivering your letters, walking your streets, while quietly owning every hospital, every school, every shopping mall, and even the houses you live in. The murmurs increased, but the president's voice cut the air like a blade. Edward, the mailman you dismissed as insignificant, was in truth the silent guardian of this city. He never sought glory. He never revealed his fortune. Instead, he dedicated his entire life to the prosperity of Brighton Hills. At that moment, some faces in the audience contorted in pure shock. There were those who remembered laughing at Edward, treating him as invisible, and now felt the shame burn within. President Williams then pointed to Ayla, calling her to approach the stage. And when Edward left this world, he did not leave his empire to the greedy hands of those who mocked him. He chose someone worthy, someone who knows what it means to suffer, to be rejected, and yet to rise with dignity. This young woman, Ayla, is his heir. The room exploded in exclamations of disbelief. Some tried to protest, but their voices sounded weak compared to the solemnity of the moment. "Impossible," shouted a man from the first row, hitting the table. "This is outrageous," completed another. But the president silenced them with a firm look. "The only thing outrageous here is how blind you've all been. For years, Ayla has been using her inheritance to fund hospitals, scholarships, homes for the poor, not only in Brighton Hills but throughout our nation. While you spent fortunes on jewels and parties, she was quietly changing lives." The cameras focused on Ayla, and for the first time her image was not that of a despised young woman, but of a leader, of someone who carried the strength of thousands of transformed lives. The same people who had laughed at her minutes before now couldn't look her in the eye. The room was immersed in a mixture of shame, admiration, and fear. President Williams walked over to her, held her hand, and raised it before everyone. "Tonight," he declared, "Ayla receives the highest honorary title ever granted in our nation, one that was last given 70 years ago to the founder of Brighton Hills. From this day forward, she is recognized as a national figure of honor and philanthropy." The applause that followed did not come from the ashamed elite, but from the ordinary people who had managed to access the event, from the employees, from the young people who studied thanks to Ayla's scholarships, from the patients who survived thanks to the hospitals funded by her. It was a sincere, powerful sound that echoed like justice in the heart of the city. Tears streamed down Ayla's face, not of sadness but of liberation. For years she had carried the weight of prejudice, the scars of exclusion, and now, before everyone, her dignity was finally recognized. Ayla's childhood in Brighton Hills seemed, to the eyes of strangers, to have improved since she was taken in by Edward, the old mailman. He gave her shelter, love, and food, but that didn't mean the world accepted her. From the first days at TU school, she realized she was different from the other children, not because she was less intelligent or less capable, but because her skin and kinky, coily hair were seen as defects. The children laughed at her during recess, calling her broomhead or burnt doll, words that echoed in her mind like invisible scars. As she ran across the playground trying to play, she was often pushed away, as if her simple presence was a source of shame. And even when she came home smiling, trying to hide the pain, Edward saw in her eyes the shadow of daily humiliations. The teachers, although less explicit, were also not free from prejudice. Whenever there was a group activity, Ayla was the last to be chosen, and when she raised her hand to answer, she was often ignored. Some educators praised white classmates for mediocre answers, while Ayla's contributions were treated as luck or chance. One day, after handing in a flawless essay, she heard a teacher say, "I didn't expect this from you, Ayla. Did someone help you?" That hurt her more than the laughter of her classmates, as it showed that even when she excelled, she wasn't given the credit. Edward, upon hearing the story, clenched his fists in silence, but always told her, "Don't let their blindness define your vision, my child." In the neighborhood, things were no different. Despite living with Edward in a small house at the city entrance, neighbors murmured comments every time she passed. Some women crossed the street with their purses clutched to their chests, as if Ayla represented danger. Children repeated their parents' prejudices, saying she could never dream of living in the downtown mansions or frequenting the exclusive clubs. At night, while helping Edward organize the letters, Ayla asked, "Why do they hate me if they don't even know me?" The old man took a deep breath, holding back tears, and replied, "Because they fear what they cannot control. But one day they will realize your worth." The words comforted him as much as her, but the wound of racism remained open, silently bleeding. In adolescence, prejudice took even crueler forms. When she tried to sign up for the school debate team, a classmate laughed and said, "What's next? A maid becoming a lawyer?" The laughter that followed echoed down the hallway, and Ayla's registration was rejected without justification. At the prom, no one asked her to dance, and when she approached a group, the circle closed, excluding her as if she were invisible. The comments about her hair became even more constant. "Why don't you straighten it? You'd look more civilized." Each sentence was a cruel reminder that, to them, she would never be enough. However, instead of surrendering, Ayla learned to keep the pain in her heart, turning it into fuel to keep fighting. Prejudice also infiltrated the places where there should have been justice. Once, in a store in downtown Brighton Hills, Ayla was followed by the security guard the entire time, as if she were a potential criminal. When she decided to buy a simple dress, the saleswoman suggested with a false smile, "Perhaps you'd prefer the clearance section, dear. This is quite expensive." Humiliated, she left the store without saying anything, but swore to herself that one day she would help other young black women never to go through that again. Edward, upon hearing the account, only said, "They judge you by what they see, but they will never see your soul until the truth forces them." These words were like armor to withstand every attack, but also reminded her that her path would not be easy. The wealthy neighbors especially didn't miss a chance to reinforce the exclusion. When Ayla started attending some cultural activities, secretly funded by Edward, she was seen as an intruder. At an art exhibition, a woman commented loudly, "She must be part of the cleaning staff, not a guest." Another added, "Edward should know better than to bring her here." Little did they know that it was Edward himself who paid for everyone's tickets, silently sustaining the entire event. Ayla kept these memories as wounds that never healed, but at the same time she began to understand the world she lived in. A place that rejected her not for who she was, but for what she represented. Despite everything, Ayla never stopped studying and dreaming. Her notebooks were full of notes, plans, and drawings of projects she wanted to realize one day. Better schools, accessible hospitals, scholarships for poor students. Many nights, she wrote next to Edward, who told her, "One day, you'll have the power to turn these pages into reality." She didn't fully understand what he meant, as she didn't yet know about the hidden fortune. But something in her heart pushed her to believe that her destiny would not be limited by the chains of prejudice. Suffering, instead of destroying, her began to mold her like iron in the fire, preparing her for something much greater. Over time, Ayla began to realize that some prejudices came even from people who pretended to be friends. A schoolmate said, "You're pretty for a black girl." Another suggested, "Maybe if you spoke differently, people would respect you more." These comments, masked as compliments, hurt as much as direct offenses, because they revealed that, even in their supposed friendship, there was contempt. She learned to smile in the face of these words, but inside she cried, "Why do I have to fight twice as hard just to be seen?" she asked herself on lonely nights. And yet, she did not give up. With every fall, she rose stronger, because she already knew that the world would never make her path easy. In her youth, the contrast between her life and that of the elite was even more striking. While the other, young women frequented expensive clubs, traveled abroad, and showed off designer clothes, Ayla dedicated her time to studying in libraries and helping Edward. She was often ridiculed for not having the same accessories or fashionable clothes, but she responded with silence. For her, every book read was a weapon against the ignorance of others. "They can take everything from you, but not your knowledge," Edward repeated. It was this belief that kept her strong, even when she felt alone against the whole world. One episode deeply marked her adolescence. During a school presentation, Ayla stood out with a powerful speech about equality, receiving applause from some teachers. But upon leaving the stage, a group of classmates surrounded her and said, "That was cute, but don't forget people like you don't get to lead." It was the first time she cried in front of everyone, feeling the brutal weight of exclusion. However, Edward was there to wipe away her tears, saying, "Crying doesn't make you weak. It washes away the pain so you can stand stronger tomorrow." These words were etched into her soul like a tattoo. The constant humiliations turned into a painful cycle. No matter where she was, at school, on the streets, in stores, there was always a cruel reminder that she was not accepted. But along with the pain, a flame of resistance was also born. Ayla began to understand that prejudice said nothing about who she was, but revealed who others chose to be. This awareness strengthened her, although it did not lessen the tears she shed in silence. Over the years, she learned to smile in public and cry in secret, cultivating the necessary strength to bear the weight she carried. And so, little by little, prejudice in Brighton Hills became not just a barrier, but the fuel that molded the young woman who would one day surprise everyone. While the elite felt secure in their arrogance, Ayla grew in silence, forged by contempt, ready to face the storm that was still to come. The days in Brighton Hills seemed longer and longer for Ayla. The older she got, the more she realized that there was no place for her in the city's social circles. In the school hallways, her steps echoed lonely, and at the parties to which she was never invited, she stayed home, watching the fireworks and luxury cars passing from the window. The isolation was not just physical, it was emotional. She felt that prejudice erected invisible walls around her, walls that prevented her from being part of something bigger. While the other young women talked about their promising futures, she wondered if she would have any place in the world. Loneliness was her constant companion. At night, in the simple room of Edward's house, Ayla cried in silence. She didn't want the old man to notice her pain, but he always knew. "You've been crying again, haven't you?" he asked with a gentle voice, and she replied with a fragile smile. The tears were the result of wounds that cruel words had left during the day. It was like carrying scars that no one could see, but that burned with every new look of disdain. As much as she tried to be strong, the isolation began to corrode her self-esteem. She wondered if she would ever be loved, respected, or simply accepted. The emptiness inside her seemed to grow with every veiled insult. At school, the isolation took on even more painful contours. When there was group work, no one wanted to join her, and when the teacher insisted, the classmates grumbled as if it were a punishment. "Why do we always get stuck with her?" was a phrase she heard frequently. At lunch, she sat alone, pretending to be focused on books she couldn't even read, as the letters blurred with her tears. The absence of real friendship was like an invisible weight that pushed her down. Even when she tried to smile, the loneliness betrayed her, revealing the sadness in her eyes. It was a silence that screamed. There were days when Ayla thought about giving up on everything. One of them was after a teacher ignored her correct answer to praise a classmate who had gotten it wrong. She ran out of the room, hid in the bathroom, and cried until she had no strength left. "Maybe I don't belong here," she whispered to herself, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The face wet with tears and the voluminous hair that had so often been a reason for mockery made her question her own value. Prejudice began to infiltrate her mind, turning into cruel doubts about her identity. That internal battle was as painful as any external offense. Even in the moments when she sought refuge in the city, prejudice accompanied her. In an elegant cafe once, she was the only person the waiter took a long time to serve. When he finally brought the order, he made sure to hand over the glass with disdain, as if the simple act of serving her was a burden. Around her, some people whispered and laughed discreetly, reinforcing the isolation. She left there with her heart in pieces, swearing never to return. "It's not fair," she repeated in thought. "I breathe the same air, I study the same books, but still I'm treated as less." This feeling of injustice pursued her, stealing her sleep and peace. Isolation also affected her soul in another way, the absence of shared dreams. While her classmates talked about trips, dating, and brilliant careers, Ayla withdrew into herself. She kept her dreams in hidden notebooks, writing stories where girls like her were heroines loved and respected. It was her way of resisting, of creating a world where the color of her skin was not a prison. But when she closed the notebooks, reality hit her like a punch to the stomach. The contrast between what she imagined and what she lived was suffocating. Loneliness was not just being alone, it was feeling that no one saw her true value. Even love seemed unattainable. When a boy showed interest, it was always followed by malicious comments. Why would he choose her? Or he must be joking. These phrases echoed in her mind, convincing her that perhaps she would never be worthy of affection. Thus, Ayla distanced herself before even trying, protecting herself from new wounds. Prejudice had planted the cruel idea in her heart that she was not enough. And this belief was perhaps the most devastating, as it made her doubt herself. With every rejection, every side-eye, the wall around her became higher, more insurmountable. In the days of greatest pain, Edward tried to be her safe harbor. He sat next to her, stroked her hair, and said, "The world may not see you now, but one day they will have no choice." His words brought some relief, but they did not eliminate the emptiness she felt. Isolation was like a constant shadow, following her wherever she went. Even at home, where she should feel free, Ayla found herself reflecting in front of the mirror. Who am I? And why do they hate me so much? These questions consumed her, without answers that could heal the pain. It was an internal abyss that no one seemed to see. Youth, which should have been light and full of discoveries, became a period of resistance for Ayla. While others experienced adventures, she learned to survive the wounds of prejudice. Her social life was almost non-existent, and her days were reduced to studies, schoolwork, and conversations with Edward. The silence of exclusion accompanied her every step, as a cruel reminder that there was no place for her in that society. Still, she clung to the little hope that remained, believing that somehow her pain would have a greater purpose in the future. However, there were times when the weight seemed unbearable. One rainy afternoon, Ayla returned home soaked after being kicked out of a clothing store where she had only tried to try on a dress. The security guard had said, "This is not for you, leave now." The humiliated look of the people around was etched in her mind. Upon arriving, she collapsed into Edward's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. He, with tears in his eyes, just hugged her, speechless. Because at that moment, even he knew that no advice could ease the pain. Prejudice had stolen another piece of her soul. Over time, Ayla began to isolate herself even more, not only from others, but also from herself. She spent hours in her room, looking at the ceiling, questioning whether there was any point in continuing to try. The dreams kept in the notebook seemed too distant, almost impossible. Isolation turned into an emotional prison, where hope fought against despair. Still, deep in her heart, a small flame remained lit. It was fragile, almost invisible, but it existed. This flame was fueled by Edward's words, by the pages she wrote, and by the intuition that her story was not yet over. And, even at the height of loneliness, Ayla swore to herself that one day, she would make the world a different place. She swore that no one else would have to go through the same wounds she carried. This silent oath would become the strength that, in the future, would surprise everyone who despised her. It was a sunny afternoon in Brighton Hills, and the city center was crowded. A cultural event organized by the City Hall brought together entire families, local politicians, and representatives of the elite. Food stalls were spread across the square, while children ran among the book and music stands. Ayla, who was already helping with social work secretly funded by her adoptive father, had been invited to participate as a volunteer. She arrived early with her shy smile and her kinky, coily hair proudly loose, believing that perhaps on that occasion, she could finally feel like part of the community. But as soon as the first glances fell on her, she realized she was mistaken. Whispers arose, followed by side-eyes that pierced her like invisible blades. Everything seemed bearable until the moment she approached the stage to hand out some books to needy children. The master of ceremonies, an elegant man in a blue suit, took the microphone and with a forced smile said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe there's been a mistake. This area is for special guests, not helpers." The word helpers came out loaded with venom, making it clear that in his eyes Ayla was nothing more than an intruder. The uncomfortable silence that followed was soon broken by discreet laughter from members of the elite sitting in the front rows. The young woman froze, holding the books with trembling hands. Her heart pounded, and for an instant she wished to disappear. But the humiliation didn't stop there. A woman in the audience stood up and said loudly, "If you want to hand out books, maybe you should start in your own neighborhood." Laughter erupted through the improvised hall, and Ayla felt her cheeks burn with shame. The children, confused, looked at her without understanding why she was being treated that way. The master of ceremonies, instead of intervening, smiled and signaled for her to leave the stage. The microphone captured his every word. "Please don't disturb the schedule. Return to your proper place." The audience applauded ironically, as if expelling Ayla was part of the spectacle. It was a moral lynching, broadcast before everyone. With tears in her eyes, Ayla stepped down from the stage. She tried to maintain her posture, but her hands trembled and her steps faltered. She felt small, crushed by the cruelty of those who considered themselves superior. In the middle of the crowd, she heard a man say, "She should be grateful we even allow her here." Another completed, "This city is not for people like her." Every word entered her heart like a knife. The pride she had always tried to maintain seemed to crumble before so many indifferent eyes. It was as if prejudice had won, as if there was no room for dignity in her life. At the same moment, Edward, who was watching from afar, clenched his fists tightly. He knew he couldn't reveal the secret of his fortune yet, but seeing his daughter humiliated in that way almost made him give up anonymity. His tear-filled eyes fixed on her and his heart screamed to intervene. But bound by his oath of silence, he remained motionless, only watching his daughter being crucified by prejudice. Inside, he felt guilty, as if he could have avoided that pain. "Hold on, Ayla," he murmured to himself. "Your time will come." The event continued as if nothing had happened. The authorities spoke, the music played, and the audience applauded while Ayla hid behind a stall trying to catch her breath. Her eyes burned and her chest seemed to suffocate with the mixture of shame and anger. "Why me? Why always me?" she thought, leaning against the wall. She didn't understand how she could be so hated for something she hadn't chosen. Her color, her hair, her origin. At that moment, the loneliness of years seemed to explode in a silent scream inside her. The world seemed too unfair, too heavy, too cruel to bear. At the end of the day, Ayla returned home in silence. She walked through the streets of Brighton Hills with the feeling that all eyes were still on her, judging, laughing, despising. When she walked through the door, she collapsed into Edward's arms, crying as never before. "Why, Father? Why do they hate me so much?" she asked, sobbing. Edward held her close to his chest, tears streaming from his own eyes, but without answers. He just repeated, "They don't know who you really are. One day they'll see." But for Ayla, at that moment, those words seemed distant, almost impossible to believe. The following days were even more painful. Whenever she walked around the city, memories of the humiliation returned like torturous echoes. Children imitated her, laughing, repeating phrases they had heard at the event. "Return to your proper place." It was as if the shame had become public, as if everyone participated in the same collective mockery. The isolation, which was once silent, had now turned into exposure. Ayla couldn't escape, and every corner of the city seemed to remind her that, for that society, she would never have value. One night, lying in her bed, Ayla stared at the dark ceiling and seriously thought about giving up. For the first time, she questioned whether it was worth continuing to fight against a world that rejected her so cruelly. "Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe they're right," she murmured to herself, burying her face in the tear-soaked pillow. But deep down, a soft voice like Edward's whispered in her mind, "You are more than what they say. You are stronger than what they believe." This voice, even fragile, was what prevented her from giving up completely. The episode in the square was marked as the worst day of Ayla's life. It was there that she understood in a cruel and definitive way the weight of the racism she carried. It was not just exclusion or mockery, it was the denial of her humanity. However, it was also on that day that something began to change within her. Between tears and pain, a silent strength was born, an intimate oath that she would never again let them humiliate her without fighting. She didn't yet know how, but the extreme injustice she had suffered would be, in the future, the fuel for the turnaround that would silence all of Brighton Hills. The Brighton Hills Centennial had been announced for months as the most important event in the city's history. An immense structure was set up in the central square, with grandstands decorated with flags, a monumental stage, and television cameras broadcasting every detail to the entire country. Authorities arrived in gleaming black cars, greeted by applause from the local elite who occupied the best seats. It was a celebration of the prosperity, safety, and architectural beauty that made the city a national reference. But behind the party, an air of arrogance lingered as the elite believed they would finally receive public recognition for their achievements. However, none of them imagined the shock that was approaching. Ayla entered the venue with firm steps, but her heart was racing. She wore a simple but elegant blue dress, and her kinky, coily hair was loose like a natural crown, marking her identity. As she walked, she felt the stares burning her skin, some curious, others openly hostile. People whispered, "Who invited her? And she doesn't belong here." Despite this, she kept her head high, remembering Edward's words, "Walk with dignity, no matter how heavy the eyes upon you." But every step seemed like a battle against an invisible army, and the pressure of exclusion weighed on her shoulders like never before. The stage was taken by local authorities, who spoke about Brighton Hill's 100 years as a symbol of success and unity. The master of ceremonies, with a theatrical voice, announced that the President of the Republic would soon reveal the name of the honoree with the country's most important honorary title. The audience cheered, believing that one of the local magnates or politicians would be chosen. At that moment, Ayla moved closer to the front, unaware that her simple presence would spark the fury of the elite. A man in a tie whispered, "She should move to the back, she's ruining the view." A woman replied out loud, "Security, remove her. She doesn't belong among us." 2 security guards approached, embarrassing her in front of everyone. "Miss, please step aside. This area is for distinguished guests," one of them said, holding her arm firmly. Ayla tried to explain she had been invited, but was interrupted by laughter from part of the audience. "She was invited? Impossible," scoffed a young businessman, provoking laughter from his friends. The cameras captured the scene, broadcasting nationally the moment a young black woman was treated as an intruder in the very heart of the city that was secretly already hers. The awkward silence among some authorities contrasted with the satisfied expressions of the elite, who reveled in the humiliation. The master of ceremonies, realizing the situation, took the opportunity to reinforce the exclusion. "Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes mistakes happen. Let's ensure this event maintains its dignity." The phrase, clearly aimed at Ayla, drew applause and laughter. The security guards pushed her to the back, and she stumbled, almost falling in front of everyone. A lady commented loudly, "She should be grateful just to be allowed near this place." The audience erupted in laughter, turning the event into a cruel spectacle of prejudice. Ayla took deep breaths, fighting to hold back tears, but her dignity was crushed before the cameras and the staring eyes. Meanwhile, the President of the Republic watched in silence with a serious expression. He had received detailed reports about the secret philanthropic projects that had changed not only Brighton Hills, but several neighboring cities. He knew the person responsible for everything was right there, being ruthlessly humiliated. The contrast between the truth he carried and the ignorance of that elite filled him with indignation. But he remained quiet for a few moments, waiting for the right time to act. Ayla, unaware of what was to come, felt only the weight of yet another public exclusion, perhaps the most devastating of all. In the audience, young people laughed and recorded videos with their cell phones. Some imitated the way Ayla walked, others mocked her hair. "Look at that mess, she thinks she's royalty." The images would spread quickly, reinforcing her humiliation on an even greater scale. She sat down in the corner, trying to catch her breath, but every burst of laughter felt like a punch to her chest. She remembered the times she had been rejected in childhood, the offenses at school, the day she was kicked out of a store. Everything seemed to return, concentrated in that single instant. It was as if the whole world had decided, once again, that she had no worth. The master of ceremonies raised his voice, preparing the audience for the historic announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we honor not just a person, but a legacy. Brighton Hills is what it is thanks to decades of vision, generosity, and sacrifice. And today the president will reveal the name of the citizen who will receive the golden honor of the nation." The anticipation was palpable. Everyone expected one of the magnates to be called. Meanwhile, Ayla remained seated in the back, invisible to many, but still feeling the heat of the contemptuous stares. The moment seemed the height of her defeat. when there was no longer any hope for dignity. The president walked to the pulpit with slow steps, observing every face in the crowd. He paused for a long time, letting the silence spread through the square. Then, with a firm and clear voice, he said, "The person we honor today has transformed not only this city but the entire nation with their generosity. Their work has given opportunities to the poor, education to children, and hope to those forgotten. Without them, Brighton Hills would not be what it is." Murmurs began among the public, and eyes turned to the businessmen sitting in the front, certain they would be called. No one even imagined what was about to happen. The moment the president held the envelope and opened the paper, Ayla's heart raced, although she didn't know why. The audience held their breath, expecting to hear the name of one of their arrogant leaders. But the president looked up and with solemnity announced, "The golden honor of the nation is awarded to Miss Ayla Johnson." A deathly silence took over the square. The laughter died instantly, and the cameras captured every expression of shock. The young woman, who minutes before had been treated as an intruder, was now revealed as the true responsible for the city's prosperity. For a moment, Ayla couldn't move. The words echoed in her mind as if they were unreal. The looks previously full of contempt were now paralyzed in disbelief. The elite, who had humiliated her publicly, stared at the president in horror, unable to accept what they heard. The security guards who had pushed her away retreated in shame. In the back, Edward, with tears in his eyes, smiled discreetly. The secret kept for decades was beginning to be revealed, and finally truth triumphed over arrogance. It was the beginning of the turnaround that would forever mark the history of Brighton Hills. The silence that took over the square after the president's announcement was almost unbearable. For a few seconds, no one knew how to react. The cameras broadcast the incredulous faces of the elite, capturing every confused look, every mouth open in astonishment. The woman who had asked for her removal swallowed hard, unable to believe that the young woman she had called an intruder was, in fact, the country's most important honoree. The businessmen whispered among themselves, trying to understand how this was possible. And in the background, the audience watching at home began to clearly see the magnitude of the injustice that had occurred moments before. The president extended his hand toward Ayla, inviting her to the stage. "Miss Ayla Johnson, please join me here," he said firmly. The security guards, previously responsible for pushing her to the back, now backed away in shame, clearing the way for her to pass. Ayla's heart beat out of sync and her legs trembled, but she walked with dignity to the center of the square. Every step was a blow to the pride of the elite, who now watched her with eyes full of regret. The laughter that had echoed minutes before turned into heavy silence, laden with shame. On stage, the president held her hand before everyone. "This young woman has done more for this city and this country than many of you combined. The schools you admire, the hospitals you praise, the security you celebrate, all were possible because of her vision and generosity. She chose to remain anonymous, giving without asking anything in return. And today, the truth comes to light." The crowd began to applaud timidly, growing until it became a collective roar. But the applause did not come from the elite, but from the ordinary people who began to recognize Ayla as the true heroine of Brighton Hills. The faces of the businessmen and politicians were a sight to behold. The master of ceremonies who had mocked her was pale, unable to look up. The lady who had laughed loudly tried to hide her face behind a fan. Young people who had recorded videos to mock now looked at the ground, embarrassed. The irony was clear. Those who had considered themselves owners of the city were, in fact, just beneficiaries of a wealth that belonged to the simple man who disguised himself as a mailman. And now his heir was there, standing in full public recognition. The president then revealed more. For decades, Brighton Hills prospered thanks to the hidden generosity of Edward Johnson, known to many as just a humble mailman. Few knew the truth. He was the founder, the investor, the silent guardian of this city. And when his time came, he entrusted everything to Ayla Johnson, his daughter in heart and heir in legacy. The crowd exploded in murmurs, unable to believe that the old mailman, so often ignored, had been the true owner of everything. The revelation was a devastating blow to the elite's arrogance. At that moment, Ayla looked up, and tears streamed down her face. The weight of years of humiliation seemed to dissolve before the exposed truth. She took a deep breath and said in a firm voice, I never wanted recognition. All I wanted was to help, to give others what I never had. But today, standing here, I understand that hiding is no longer enough. You laughed at me, you pushed me aside, but still, I chose to build for you, not against you. The audience's silence was absolute, as if every word was an arrow hitting guilty hearts. The cameras captured every detail, and thousands of people across the country cried in front of the television. The contrast between the suffering humiliation and the revelation of her true identity was devastating. Some businessmen tried to approach to congratulate her, but the president raised his hand and said, "Not today. Today she doesn't need your empty words, she has the recognition of a nation." The phrase was met with thunderous applause, and the elite shrank further into their seats. For the first time, they did not control the narrative. The ordinary people, on the other hand, began to shout her name. Ayla, Ayla, Ayla. The chorus spread through the square like a wave, breaking the silence of the elite's shame. Children raised their hands, smiling, as if they saw a new hope in her. Black women, moved, cried as they felt they finally had a representative recognized with the highest honor. Every applause, every tear, every shout was an act of reparation in the face of decades of hidden injustice. The stage, which had been a scene of humiliation, was now an altar of victory. The master of ceremonies tried to speak again, but was ignored by the president, who declared, "From this day forward, the history of Brighton Hills will no longer be written only by the few. It will carry the name of Ayla Johnson, the true heart of this city." At that moment, the big screen showed images of the social work she had financed. Children studying, hospitals operating, families receiving support. The truth was undeniable, and any attempt to deny her importance became ridiculous in the face of the evidence. The elite, who had laughed before, now trembled under the weight of the revelation, and it was in this brutal contrast that repentance began to be born. Men and women who had mocked now faced their own children, who looked at Ayla with admiration. Some cried in silence, others tried to justify themselves, but they knew that nothing could erase the shame. Ayla didn't need to take revenge with words. The truth itself had taken care of crushing the pride of those who humiliated her. The shock was so great that many felt that the entire city had changed in a matter of minutes. In the end, when the president placed the gold medal around her neck, Ayla closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It was more than an award. It was the reparation for a lifetime of pain. The title that only the city's founder had received now rested on the shoulders of the girl they tried to erase. And there, before everyone, a new chapter for Brighton Hills was born. A chapter where the truth could no longer be hidden behind prejudice or arrogance. When the applause ceased, the silence that followed was one of reverence. Ayla remained standing on the stage, holding the gold medal against her chest, feeling the symbolic weight of that moment. Her gaze swept the crowd, and for an instant met the faces of those who had humiliated her moments before. Some looked away, others cried in silence, but all were disarmed. The truth had ripped off the city's mask. The young woman who had carried years of exclusion was now the voice of a new era, and everyone knew that nothing would ever be the same. The president, after formalizing the tribute, handed the microphone to her. Ayla took a deep breath and looked at the cameras, as if speaking not just to Brighton Hills but to the entire country. "All my life I was told I didn't belong, that my skin, my hair, my very existence made me less. Today I stand here not for myself, but for every child who has been told the same lie. You are not less. You are not invisible. You are worthy." Her firm voice broke the hearts of many in the audience, and tears streamed even from the eyes of those who until minutes before had despised her. Ayla's words echoed like thunder in every corner of the square. Young people held their parents' hands, looking at them with disapproval, as if asking, "How could you treat her that way?" Black women hugged each other, feeling that they finally had a representative who spoke for all of them. The ordinary people moved, shouted, and applauded, celebrating not only her victory, but the hope that their own voices would also be heard. It was more than an award. It was an act of historical justice, a correction of the silence that had lasted generations. That night, Brighton Hills was no longer the same. The streets, previously taken over by the arrogance of the elite, vibrated with the pride of the people. Children imitated Ayla, pretending to give speeches in front of mirrors. In the humblest homes, families toasted in her honor, silently thanking her for the schools, hospitals, and projects she had secretly funded. Meanwhile, in the elite mansions, the atmosphere was one of shame. Men and women who had laughed before now reflected on how they had become blind by prejudice. It was impossible to erase the scene broadcast live across the country. Edward, sitting in his rocking chair that same night, cried in silence. He had protected the secret for decades, believing it was best to keep the city stable. Now he saw that his daughter had not only inherited his fortune, but also his courage and humanity. "You did it, my girl," he murmured, looking at the old portrait of his deceased wife. "You turned pain into power." His heart was at peace, because he knew that the city's future was safe in the hands of someone who understood the value of justice more than anyone else. The next day's newspapers ran headlines in large letters. "From humiliation to honor, Ayla Johnson, the true soul of Brighton Hills." The images of the event traveled the country and crossed borders, becoming a symbol of the fight against prejudice. Universities invited her to lecture. NGOs sought her partnership, and even international leaders sent messages of recognition. But for Ayla, none of this mattered as much as the look of the city's children, who now saw her as an example that the color of one's skin does not determine the value of a life. Over time, Ayla transformed the public shame into a social movement. She created foundations that supported young people from minorities, financed scholarships, and promoted projects that directly challenged entrenched structures of prejudice. Every school built, every hospital maintained was a living reminder that dignity is not asked for, it is earned. Those who once despised her now sought her approval, but she never stooped to arrogance. She received everyone with politeness but remembered the past. Respect is not about words, it's about actions. The elite, although regretful, had to live with the memory of their own cruelty. Many tried to approach Ayla to clear their conscience, but they knew they would never be forgotten for what they had done. The greatest punishment for them did not come from harsh words, but from Ayla's dignified indifference. She did not humiliate them back, but she also did not allow them to steal the luster of her achievement. They learned the hard way that racism not only destroys those who suffer, but also those who practice it, corroding their own humanity. At every centennial anniversary, the city remembered not only its founding, but the day the truth came to light. Monuments were erected in honor of Edward and Ayla, and her name entered history books as an example of courage and resilience. What was once the blind pride of the elite became the collective pride of a people who learned, by force, the value of justice. Brighton Hills was no longer just the most prosperous city in the country, but also a symbol of overcoming prejudice. Deep down, Ayla knew that there would still be challenges. Racism would not disappear overnight, and many would continue to judge by what they saw and not by what really mattered. But now she had a voice, she had power, and above all, she had the truth on her side. Nothing could erase the scars, but they had turned into marks of victory. "I will never be silent again," she promised herself, looking in the mirror. "And I will make sure no one else has to live in silence either." Thus, the story that began with humiliation and exclusion ended in dignity and strength. The entire city was transformed by the revelation that true greatness is not in the color of one's skin, money, or titles, but in the ability to resist and give back with love what was received as hatred. Ayla Johnson became not only the heir of Brighton Hills, but also an eternal symbol that prejudice can be defeated when truth and courage rise above injustice.